My name is Sid Robinson, and this is my film review project for History 2230. I'm going to be talking about the 1997 Hollywood film, Amistad. Amistad is a cinematic retelling of the true story of La Amistad, which was a Spanish slave ship in the first half of the 19th century. In 1839, this ship famously suffers an insurrection, and the African slaves aboard break free of their bonds, kill most of their captors on the ship, and commandeer and take control of the ship. Now, these Africans, being not themselves sailors and on La Amistad in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, are forced to keep a small number of these Spanish sailors alive to run the ship for them. And they instruct these Spanish men to turn the ship around and return to Africa. But these Spanish sailors are actually able to fool their new captors and force the ship north. The ship had been traveling between Spain and Cuba, and they are able to force it north at nighttime into American territory, where it gets picked up by American customs agents. Or rather, as they're known at the time, American revenue agents. Right? They're assessing taxes on people coming in, so they're raising revenue for the government. I think this is another example of how this is back when we had a Department of War instead of the Department of Defense, and the government hasn't yet learned the marketing trick of sanitizing every term it uses for everything that it does. Just a little funny anecdote. I thought it was funny that the customs agents were originally called revenue agents. Anyway, if this sounds like the setup for if this sounds like a premise for a great high seas action adventure movie, that's not what we've got here. You're going to be a little disappointed because that all gets wrapped up in the first 15 minutes of the movie. Rather than a more realistic and grounded Pirates of the Caribbean, what this film actually is a courtroom drama, better understood in an analogy to a feature-length episode of Law & Order SVU, where at the start of the episode there's some cold open or action, and then the bulk of the narrative of the episode follows some sort of legal investigation. But the dramatic tension for the viewer isn't so much about resolving the mystery of what happened, but in observing and understanding how the justice system is going to react to what happened, and how all of the little legal mechanisms are actually going to work out in this case, and what the resolution is going to be, rather than following an investigation to find out what it is that happened. So, what is the legal drama all about? Well, it turns out that there are a bunch of different factions, actually, that want a piece of La Amistad or have an opinion on what should be the resolution here. So, first off, there's one faction that wants to see these slaves tried for murder and given capital punishment, basically, because, they killed their captors on their ship. It was a massacre, as it's first reported in the press. But, interestingly, there are a bunch of other parties that are not actually interested in seeing the slaves put to death because they want to claim them as property. For example, there are these two Spanish sailors who were left alive who would like to see all of the slaves and the ship returned to them as their personal possessions. Also, the Queen of Spain gets involved, the Queen of Spain being Isabella II, at this time an 11-year-old girl. But anyway, she has some claim on the basis of a treaty made between the United States and Spain that recovered Spanish vessels should be returned to her, and she'd like to see them and the slaves returned to her. And then naval officers involved in rescuing La Amistad are making a salvage claim, which was a thing at the time. If you rescue the ship out in the ocean, you were entitled to claim some portion of the goods that you saved, and this law was supposed to help encourage people to save sinking ships, right? To render aid to someone who needs it, because you get a piece of the pie. And then, furthermore, there are these slaves arguing that they were not actually slaves, which is kind of interesting, and really where the bulk of the drama of the movie comes in. So this actually makes for one of the most fun scenes of the film, where the presiding judge gets increasingly incredulous as each party interrupts the proceedings to make their own claim. But it turns out that this is actually something that the filmmakers had to simplify quite a bit to get into the film, and that in the real case of La Amistad, there were actually even more parties making claims. There were multiple different parties making salvage claims, and multiple members of the Spanish nobility making property claims, and it was actually an extremely complicated case. One concept that gets explored in this film is the idea of there being language barriers. None of the Amistad slaves speak English, and the Americans pretty much exclusively speak English. And this obviously presents a huge barrier in actually getting their story and figuring out exactly what happened. And their Spanish captors very explicitly take advantage of this. The primary thing you need to understand to follow the courtroom drama of this film is that at this time in American history, the Atlantic slave trade had been ended. Of course, slavery still existed in America. This was pre-Civil War. But the practice of enslaving free black people elsewhere in the world, Africa primarily, and then importing them had been ended. And the slave trade, legally, was entirely domestic. And the only way that somebody could be a slave was to be born a slave. As it turns out, the Spanish slavers have actually been illegally participating in the Atlantic slave trade and intending to pass these Amistad slaves off as being Spanish plantation slaves from Havana, Cuba. One of the things that tips everyone off that this is not the case is that none of these slaves actually speak Spanish. And when they do eventually find an interpreter for these slaves and they get to tell their story, you can imagine how difficult it is to tell a compelling story through a translator to a courtroom. However, unlike the jurors in that courtroom, us film watchers get to see the slave's tale told in full motion picture, which is not necessarily an added plus for us versus the jurors. This is a 10 or 15 minute sequence that depicts a person's capture, sale, and transport of slave cargo in a growing crescendo of violence and brutality that culminates in the mass murder of a group of cargo slaves when their slavers realize that they haven't brought enough food to get everybody across the ocean. I think that this sequence is very much comparable to the opening of the film Saving Private Ryan, where it's very obvious that the filmmakers have set out to make you feel disgust and horror and discomfort, and they have very much successfully accomplished that task. Another interesting theme that gets explored in this film is the independence of the American judicial system. Isabella, the aforementioned child monarch of Spain, has trouble understanding why the serving American president, Martin Van Buren, can't just order the courts to give her her property back. Why does he have to be subordinate to the courts? Her courts do what she tells them to do. And so the Americans want to make an ideological stand here and be like, that's not how it works in America. We have the rule of law. But then that immediately gets subverted when a group of Southern politicians show up and tell Martin Van Buren that his reelection is in jeopardy if these Amistad slaves win their case. And the president and the Secretary of State find a way to strong-arm the federal judge into recusing himself from the case so that they can reappoint a Southern pro-slavery judge to try the case instead. So again, this is just completely subverting the arguments about the independence of the courts that these same men were just making to the Queen of Spain. So one thing that this film can be criticized for is that it tries a little too hard to tie this Amistad incident into the greater story of the abolishment of slavery as a whole. Throughout the film, many characters are making reference to how these events are going to affect people's opinions on the coming Civil War. The Civil War being, 20 years later, this is not exactly historically accurate that everybody was talking about how there's going to be a Civil War over the issue of slavery. Also, in the final courtroom scene of the film, which is arguments in front of the Supreme Court, the filmmakers basically completely diverged the arguments away from the legal issues that were being discussed in reality, and what appears to be on trial itself is the institution of slavery, with John Quincy Adams arguing against the inhumanity of slavery itself and how the founders made this mistake when they wrote the Declaration of Independence and it's time to end it. And I think somebody who was only half paying attention could easily be misled into believing that this film ends with the Supreme Court ending slavery, because they try to really tie these things together, and that's not really what the Amistad case was about, even though it was a slavery-related matter that got a lot of national press. So that's Amistad. It's a long film at 2.5 hours. It can feel a little bit slow, especially towards the end of the film, where it gets kind of into Lord of the Rings type territory, where it's like, okay, are the credits going to roll? No? Okay. No? Still no? Okay. But if you've got the patience for it, it's definitely a very interesting 19th century Law and Order episode about a very unique happening in American history. So, be sure to like and subscribe, I guess.